Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Well, hello and welcome to episode 142 of the podcast. In this episode, I talk with Amber Lappin about building faith in babies, which is probably not something you thought about before. I mean, don't get me wrong. Anybody that has served in children's ministry knows it's not childcare, even in the preschool years where kids are younger and maybe you don't feel like they're going to learn as much. We all know that there's a lot they can learn, but I don't know if you've ever thought about building faith in babies. So it's an interesting conversation that Amber and I have where she shares about ways that we can build faith in babies in our children's ministry and churches. Now, before I jump into that interview, I've mentioned this past couple of weeks, but if you want to train your volunteers online, Trained Up is one of the best platforms you'll find out there, actually adding some new things, changing their name, or at least adding Trained Up as a piece of a larger suite of services and software that they're going to provide. But Trained Up's a great platform to put training online so that your volunteers can train kind of on demand. And that could be videos that Trained Up made, it could be videos you make. Maybe it's videos that you got from another source. That's a lot of what we use it for. It can even be stuff that's not video content. It's just a great platform to help train your volunteers more than just in person or the large group gathering trainings that you might do. It's just another great option for training your volunteers. To get 10% off for life of your subscription, go to ministryboost.org/trainedup. And when you sign up, use the code BOOST10. All right, let's go ahead now and jump into my interview with Amber Lappin about building faith in babies. Well, today I'm talking with Amber Lappin. Welcome to the podcast, Amber.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So tell us about you and your family and your ministry. Kind of introduce us to yourself as we get started.
All right. Well, my family is probably the simplest to explain. My husband and I just celebrated in August, celebrated our 27th wedding anniversary. And we're celebrating this year our first year of having an empty nest, which is not as awful as one would think. It's kind of enjoyable. But our children are close. My son works for a fire department just about an hour and a half away, and my daughters are finishing up their last year at Cal Baptist. So it's just me and my husband and a little new kitten and a doggy, and it's just us, which we enjoy very much.
Awesome. And how about your ministry, which, as you're saying, may not be as simple to explain?
Yes. Well, I have 5 jobs. So I work for a pair of local accredited preschools as a program director. I also teach at our local college in the early education department. And then I teach foster parenting classes for a local community college, a different one. And then I also write a lot. So I do a lot of different writing projects. I do a lot of blog posts for Spark House. And then I have my own training and consulting business. So I get to travel all around and do that. So I have a lot of jobs, but they're all my favorite things to do. So I seem to have whittled it down to not having to do anything horrible.
That's great. Well, I mean, and you get to do all of them, right? So I guess if they're all your favorite, it's great that you can't just do one. You get to do all of them, so that's fun. And am I correct in saying that you used to lead as a children's pastor before?
I did yes. I was for 9 years a part of a children's ministry leadership team where I did all the training, a lot of the recruiting and scheduling and hands-on stuff. So yeah, I did that for 9 years.
And that's a lot of who we're going to be talking to today, because we're going to talk about building faith in babies. So I'm sure it's a lot of children's pastors, preschool ministry leaders listening. And I feel like, and maybe, I'm probably good. I'm probably accurate at this. I feel like pretty much everybody listening to this podcast feels like all of children's ministry is ministry. It's not babysitting. It's not childcare. But I think there's certainly people who are thinking building faith in babies, that's interesting. Like, how does that work? So I think the first obvious question is, can babies really learn faith concepts?
I think that questions like that are what got me into training in the first place. I had been a Sunday school teacher for a long time, right out of high school. And at the same time, I was getting my education in early education. And I was studying child development. My associates was in just early education. Then I went ahead and got my bachelor's in human development. And during those years of studying human development, and then eventually my master's in early education again, all of those things, I kept thinking, wow, there's so much I'm learning about how a child's brain develops, how they're learning so much in their first 5 years, especially how quickly children's formative, brains are forming, the brains are forming into who they're going to be. And then we're treating a lot of times in the very beginning of my ministry, a lot of times there was children's ministry that started at age 2, but there was nursery ministry where children would just kind of be held and kept alive while their parents went to church. And there wasn't a lot of intentionality in how to get those faith concepts through to their little brains. And so it was that question that got me interested. Well, how could we mix developmental science, like the science of human development, with the wonder of children's ministry? How can we use this amazing time where children are learning things so quickly? How can we make sure they get a good faith foundation? So that's a very long way to say yes. Children can learn faith concepts as early as in utero, really, as children are starting to grow from infancy all the way through. There are things that we can do to prepare them, to get them ready so that when they are hearing the gospel in an increasingly developmentally appropriate way, that they have a good foundation and they can understand things in a deeper, more realistic way than perhaps somebody who hears about faith for the first time when they're 40.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned like that age of 2, which I'd say is pretty common. You see a lot of churches doing some type of intentional curriculum would be the bigger word, but intentional effort to teach kids at 2. But even then, maybe not. So there's probably some churches listening where that doesn't start till 3 or 4 or something like that. Mm-hmm. So what? And we all understand why it's important to pass faith on to children, but why is it important for children to start learning about faith at such a young age as babies?
Well, I think of it kind of like if you're teaching children about reading. A child who has never been read to struggles really hard with reading in kindergarten and first grade. They need to have the experience of just sitting in a lap and having the pages turned so they can learn that how the books, what way the pages turn, what way the words go, what the sounds, the more sounds they hear, the more they can understand about sounding out phonemes, all of those things. They need a foundation. So that's why even to a baby, we're singing A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We're singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Jesus Loves Me, all of those little tiny simple songs that are just getting their brains ready for eventually reading and having conversations and all of that. Well, it's the same thing with faith. We want to get their brains primed and ready so that they can understand concepts that are really hard to understand, like faith, hope, and love. So understanding how to have faith becomes as it relates to God, has a much better understanding if in your tiny little world you've understood what faith feels like, how you can have faith and trust in the people who care for you. Then a baby who understands that is going to grow into a child who can more readily understand that they can have faith in a God who will care for them.
And what does that look like practically? Thinking about the children's ministry folks who are listening, what does that look like in their children's ministry at church, but also maybe even at home for parents?
I think it looks like being intentional, which I understand is kind of that buzzword right now, and people go, well, what does that mean exactly? But to me, it just means that we have to know what our goals are in order to make sure that it happens. So, for example, if I just eat whatever I want every single day, the chances are I will just only have carbs all week because that's just what I want to have. But if I have in my head, I need to have vegetables every day, I need to have fruit every day, protein is important, and I understand those things, then I'll be careful to make sure I get all of those ingredients every single day. Well, for parents, if we're just thinking, I need to keep them alive and I need to, or as caregivers, I need to keep them alive and I need to make sure that they don't cry. If those are our only two goals, that's all we'll do for all of the time that we have them. But it's such a short period of time, we have to purpose and go, okay, I want to make sure that this child understands faith. I want this child to understand hope. I want them to understand love. And then that practically means shaping activities and our language and our behaviors with that goal in mind.
Yeah. And I think a part of it too is just kind of like you're saying, being intentional in the sense that it's the decision that we're going to do something with, kids at this age, as opposed to just viewing it like childcare. And then you can start figuring out, okay, what are we going to do? And I know, and you've probably seen this before, and I don't think I plan to ask you this question, but we have volunteers because we do, even doing curriculum as young as 2. I remember when we started doing that. Well, I guess we always did that when we launched the church, but there were volunteers early on who were just thought it was too much. Like this isn't worth it. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. And anybody who's worked with that age knows you're not going to get them all sitting down, listening, paying attention at the same time. You know what I mean? Like if that's what your goal is, you're not going to get that. But if your goal is just to get something in them, you can get that. And we have so many stories of that. But like, what would you say to the volunteer or the church leader that needs to convince the volunteer that this is helpful? This, like, they will catch this. How do you help them get their arms around that when it probably feels to them like this is pointless because they're not really, they're not really going to get it. It feels like I'm just wasting my time. You know what I mean?
Well, I think I came across that same thing when I first started training, especially in the younger ages, the infants, toddlers and 2s, but also even the 3s and 4s. When I first started looking in a lot of preschool classrooms in the church, I found that the children were not expected to do much. And what I discovered is that they didn't really understand what children were capable of doing. So what I did is because I worked at a preschool, I actually took a bunch of my key volunteers to a preschool for them to see what the children were capable of doing. And they were just blown away. They had, the 2-year-olds were all sitting at a table, serving their own peas and pouring their own milk and saying, please pass the, whatever, chicken nuggets. And they were behaving like civilized humans, 2-year-olds at a table. And the preschool teachers were blown away or the preschool volunteers from the church were blown away because they were still coloring for them because they were afraid the children were going to eat the crayons. They just didn't get how much a 2-year-old is capable of doing. And so that helped us change the culture a little bit once they understood that they're capable of more than we're giving them credit for. And the next thing that they learned from watching that, and since when I do training, I try to really adjust expectations of what success looks like in a 2-year-old room or a 3-year-old room. All the children are never going to sit down at the same time. In fact, best practices in early education is that children are never supposed to be required to participate in anything because that struggle that they have with trying to force them to sit or force them to do an art project actually interrupts their learning process. So instead of learning what they would be learning, they're learning about how to escape. So we had to adjust expectations. First, we had to show that what children were capable of. Then we had to show that our expectations are not that everybody sits crisscross applesauce, hands in their basket, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. Let's all pay attention and take notes. That's just not going to happen. It barely happens in a church sanctuary. It's certainly not going to happen with the tiny children. But what we also had to help them understand was that children pick up little things as they go. And that's demonstrated in watching with popular culture. You see children, wandering around singing, let it go, from a movie that they've maybe watched only 1 or 2 times in the beginning, and they already are huge fans. So we know they're listening and we know that they're learning. And we know that, children even at this age are really hard to feed. They don't They don't want to eat what you want them to eat. They don't want to eat nutritious things. They only graze. They go on food strikes. And we can't at any point say, well, it's not worth it to try to feed these children because they're so resistant to it, right? But sometimes we do that with spiritual things. We go, well, it's not worth it. But we know, just the same as, you brush baby teeth and you care for we understand that what children eat when they're children affects them as adults. Well, if that's true with physical food, isn't it also true for spiritual food? And so we really like for teachers, especially those who work in spiritual situations, to understand that every single thing that happens is part of a child's spiritual journey. Everything, every bit of care that they get has value for them, not just for their childhood, but into adulthood and really for eternity. So that's pretty high stakes.
Yeah, definitely. I used to say, I remember, gosh, this was like 10 years ago at one of our volunteer trainings. I mentioned, and we had preschool and elementary volunteers all together. And I mentioned I grew up in church and, I couldn't remember anything I was taught as a preschooler or who taught me, but I just knew God loved me and had such a positive image of God that I know I got in those preschool years. So even the content itself, I can't remember what I would have known or been able to memorize or what songs I could have sung. I don't remember back then. But there was that was just in me, and I got that impression. And I remember a volunteer then afterwards telling me, and I don't think her words were, I just saw his childcare, but that's what she was saying. I thought it was good and helpful. I'm helping parents attend the church and kids have a safe place and all of that. But I never pictured it like that. And obviously this concept too, that we can even teach them and have those words in their language and in their mind early is helpful. Mm-hmm. And you talk about faith, hope, and love.
Right.
And so tell us about that and teaching that to babies, starting with faith. What does that look like? How do you talk about that?
Well, I think that what you were saying is so valuable that we don't remember the exact lessons. You just remembered that God loved you. Well, that's a good preschool concept. But before that, once we're talking about our 0 to 2s, they need to understand what love is before they can understand that God loves them. Yeah. And the same thing with you. You could have faith with God. Well, what's faith? Well, you can have hope in God. Well, what's hope? And that isn't taught. Children 0 to 2 do not learn from a PowerPoint presentation. They need somebody to invest and show them what it looks like and feels like as a foundational concept. So starting with faith, I think that we have to kind of look at what faith actually is. And a couple of different things that are important to look at is that this is kind of their pre-faith period. So we're not actually going to reach the goal at 0 to 2 of having children have faith. What we're doing is we're looking in this pre-faith period and getting their brains and neurons and everything ready for them to understand that that when their faith is formed by the safety and security, when their faith is they have nurturing in their lives, then those positive experiences prepare them for a positive experience with God. Mm-hmm. And negative experiences consequently create a distrust of people. And a person who has a distrust of people is really going to wrestle with having a trust of God. So in early education, we look at, part of the reason that I kind of chose a jumping off point of just choosing faith, hope, and love is really that 1 Corinthians 13:13 verse of faith, hope, and love abide. These three, and the greatest of these is love. So that we could look at this and go, okay, well, if Jesus is narrowing down what it is that children want to understand, what he wants people to understand, and specifically children in our case, we know that he said love. He wants us to learn how to love each other. He wants us to learn how to love God, and he wants us to understand his love for us. So that means that we have to really look at, first of all, being faithful with our words. So we'd learn in Romans 10 somewhere that faith comes from hearing, right? And then hearing comes from the word of God. So children need to hear God's words from a small age so they can start developing that vocabulary. And for small children, that's going to look like singing "Jesus Loves Me" as you're holding onto a baby. It means, as you're changing their diaper, you are talking to them about, oh, I love that God made your toes and God made your little nose and, all of those things. And the reason that I bring this up, even though it seems supernatural, is that I notice a lot of times, and this is not a slam on anybody that works in nursery, but I notice a lot of times, nursery volunteers, they end up sitting in rocking chairs and holding babies happily and loving them very much, but they're having conversations over their heads with each other about how, what happened this week and, their best friend whose son ran away from home or, whatever. And they're having this conversation over their heads, and forgetting that these little ears, even though they may not understand exactly what's happening in the conversation, they are hearing the tone of what's happening. They're hearing vocabulary words and sounds. And so really we want to look at having really intentional conversations with the babies themselves instead of with one another. That doesn't mean that, they can't talk to each other. Of course, we want to do that and encourage social conversation, but a lot of times it turns into gossip and not kind words. So we have to be super careful about that and be really faithful in the way that we talk. There's some crazy studies about what children understand. In fact, there was a study where they tested to see if babies would respond, and they did, and amazingly, to the sound of the theme song from the soap operas that their mom listened to when they were in utero. And the babies would turn their heads to that particular song because they were so familiar with it. And I think, well, if that's true, if even babies in utero have a familiar feel for a song that is of no consequence to their development, how much more exciting would it be if the sound that they would turn to would be the sounds of praise?
Yeah. Yep.
So that's one way of being faithful, is being faithful with our words, but also being faithful with our care, meaning that we have to make sure that a child is getting the attention that they need right away. And there is an old school feeling that if you pick up a baby too fast, you are spoiling them. And developmentally, we know that that's not true. Science shows that a child who is picked up immediately when they're crying and cared for immediately when they're crying doesn't learn to manipulate. They learn trust, and they learn that they could have faith that their needs are going to be met. And so it's really important in a church nursery to, first of all, make sure you have enough volunteers to be able to meet the needs of the children in your care. The children are not crying for extended periods of time because there's not enough people. And that might even mean being tough and closing a nursery because you don't have enough volunteers. So if you have this many babies and this many volunteers and more babies come, to say we don't have enough to give the proper kind of care. Because it's better for a child to, be in their mother's arms in the service than it is for them to be screaming in a nursery and getting the idea that church is not a safe place to be. Mm-hmm. And so those sorts of things, every time they get what they need, then they understand later when we start talking about Christ is the meter of our needs. God is the meter of our needs. If you have not had a positive experience with having your needs met, how can that be something that you can understand?
Yeah. What about, I know that it feels like, we talked about faith and even love and how to show that and how they can learn that. How about hope? What does hope look like to a baby? How do babies learn about hope?
Well, hope is a funny thing. It's one of those things that, I think that you can get through just about any hard thing in your life if you have hope, right? If you think that this will eventually be over or eventually be better. And when we start getting hopeless is when we start feeling this feeling known as desperation. And children go from, hopeful to desperate very, very quickly. I remember my babies just laying on the floor when I was in the bathroom thinking I was never coming back. Like, this is it. This is how it ends.
Yeah.
Mom, close the door. So they go very quickly. So they need to learn about something called object permanence. They need to understand that something exists when it's not in their eyesight. And that's really hard for little guys to learn. It actually isn't until they're 2 that they fully start, and even a little bit older, they fully start getting that concept. So really we're in the pre-version of that again. So that's why we play things that we have played with babies since the dawn of time. Peekaboo, where you put a toy under a blanket and put it back up. Hide, snack under the cup and then lift it up. Even silly games like Where's Thumbkin, or, where to go? Where'd mommy go? Oh, here she is. Those sorts of things, which seem like the silliest thing, but they're actually teaching a faith concept. That is that you can hope in something that you cannot see. And that is like one of the biggest struggles that adults have, right? In faith is, I can't see God. I can't see what he's doing. Is he still there when I can't see or hear from him? And toddlers are going to understand that a lot better if somebody has intentionally spent time with them to help them understand that things exist when they're out of their eyesight. That's why we have such a bad time in this age group with separation anxiety. Can you imagine how much you'd flip out if you thought that when you dropped your child off at nursery, they'd cease to exist? It would be terrible. So the babies have that feeling like maybe mom is never coming back. Maybe dad is disappeared forever. And so we have to teach them things like, the little song, mommy comes back, daddy comes back, those silly things that don't seem like you're teaching a faith concept, but you are teaching them about object permanence, which is one of those things that really helps fine tune our ideas about who God is, even when we can't see him.
Now, do you think, is it something too where in teaching them hope, there's things you're saying to them, singing to them, kind of like with faith and love as well, putting words around it?
Yes. And using those words like, oh, I hope that I hope that mommy's coming back. Oh, look, mommy came back just like we hoped. Like those sorts of things are great for that. And one of the things that we get tempted to do when we're in ministry is that we want everything to point back to God directly and obviously. And I would say that it's okay to do that covertly in a maybe a less obvious way, because the idea of don't worry, God loves you is completely not something that a 2-year-old can understand. They understand what's closest to them. They develop proximo-distally, which means from the inside out, and they understand their whole entire universe is their parents at this point. And so they can only understand hope in their parents. Hope in God is just, we can use that language, but we can't expect that it's going to bring comfort.
Sure. Yeah. How about, so I mentioned this before we started recording, even when we were doing curriculum from the very beginning with kids that were age 2, there was some pushback from volunteers like, hey, they're not going to get this. This is a waste of time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or in some cases it might have been, hey, they're never going to get it. Why are we even doing this? In some cases it might have been, I understand some measure of trying to teach them, so to speak, but not, this is too much. So, but we got both of those kinds of criticism. So how would you say that church leaders could convince their volunteers, and then also leadership? Like leadership needs to understand that this isn't just babysitting. So
right.
How can both parties be convinced? So we talked a little bit earlier about volunteers and what that looks like for them, but leadership also should be on board and should see it, even if maybe it's not an issue of whether or not they're on board, but they should see it as like it's a ministry and there's more happening there than it is just babysitting, even at this young age, right?
Right. Well, 2 things. One of the things that can really help volunteers to understand that it's possible is to give them small bite-sized things. So if you were to say, like, today we're working on hope. So here are some games that we can play, peekaboo, whatever, and then just tell them, and that's going to help them understand about hoping in God. And then even having a sign up for the parents. Today we really worked on hope. Here's something you can do at home. You can play peekaboo with your child and talk about hope. Those sorts of things can really help the teachers who are resistant or the volunteers who are resistant to understand we're not talking about sitting them down and making them do worksheets. We're talking about just taking a concept, one concept, and really intentionally making sure that the children have exposure to that in whatever stage they're in, and whether they're a newborn who's just laying in a cradle, they can still understand, they can start understanding hope. Or a 2-year-old who is running around crazy, they can also understand hope. And when you break it down like that and make it simpler, I think that that really helps the convincing. And as far as with leadership, and having been on staff at a church in the early days, they would call half of it children's ministry, and then they would call it childcare. And I don't hate the phrase childcare because it has the word care in it, and I think that that's what we're supposed to be doing. But it does seem to be that the nursery through 2-year-olds does seem to be viewed as, well, we don't want these children interrupting our service, and so we will always go, well, we'll have a special praise service, and we don't have to have children's ministry, but we do want to make sure the babies are taken care of. And they didn't mean taken care of like given faith concepts. They mean taken care of as in not crying when we're trying to pray. And so that was a lot of just educating and reminding, like, okay, we can do that, but we need to get solid volunteers. It can't just be anybody. A lot of times in the early days, they'd go, well, all the pastors' wives will just go in and watch the babies for us while we do this thing. Well, we would never do that with the pulpit. We would never go, well, everybody's going to be busy, so we'll just choose somebody to fill in for the pastor while he's gone. Her husband, his wife. Mm-hmm. We would never do that. We would only put in a specialist, somebody who specializes in preaching at the pulpit. And so what we did is we started saying, we need a nursery specialist or a nursery volunteer, somebody who's been trained in that area, so that we're having the idea that just the same as your worship team cannot just be people who like to play the guitar, who think guitars are fun. It has to be people who are trained and rehearsed. The same thing needs to be allowed, which means time and energy and sometimes budget needs to be dedicated to nursery just the same as any other ministry in the church. Yeah.
How about any other thoughts as we kind of wrap up, and anything that we didn't cover that would be helpful for church leaders or even parents, thinking about building faith in babies?
I just think that the idea that what you're doing is important and lasts a lifetime. Remembering that all of these things, even, teaching about faith and hope, all of those things really point to love. And these things are pretty natural for us. We think, we love our babies. That's easy. But there's a lot of fatigue involved in either volunteering or caring for a small baby. They're super, super demanding, and they're super intense. And there's not a lot of downtime. You can't say to a group of babies, you guys just read in your Bible for a few minutes, or, let's play the be quiet game. Those things don't work. And so there's a lot of fatigue and tiredness. And so remembering about that, the scripture that says, do not grow weary in doing good. For in due season, you will reap the harvest if you do not give up. And that idea that you are in the early stages of this garden, right? So maybe youth ministry is, pruning, and children's ministry of, the older children is maybe, watering, but this is the seed planting. And that's really important part. You can't have the other parts without this part. And so, yes, it's true that a child can come to church for the first time in the 4th grade and they can get it, and there's absolutely hope. I don't mean to say that if they don't get it when they're 18 months, then all is lost. But I am saying it is so much easier for these children if they have these concepts, if they've been given the nurturing that they want, if they feel safe, if they feel that they can be cared for by people other than their parents. That's an actually good thing for them to understand. And And then making sure that we are also understanding as ministry leaders that we can never assume that the children are getting these things at home. Just the same as if you had a homeless shelter, and to use a food analogy, again, I must be hungry, to use a food analogy, like if you had a homeless shelter, you don't give them all Snickers bars to just tide them over. You're assuming, because you have to, this is their only meal that they're going to have today. And so you make sure that has nutrition. And the same thing is true for these little guys. Like, we cannot assume, especially when we look statistically, 1 in 4 children is a victim of abuse now, maybe even 1 in 3, at least 1 in 4. We have to assume that there are children that at some point in their lifetime will not be cared for correctly, that will be failed by the adults who are supposed to be caring for them. And let's let that not be in the church. Let's let that be church to be an actual sanctuary where children are safe, where their people have prayed together, their adults have prayed together, have prayed with the children. Let them be able to be cared for by people who genuinely love small children, who genuinely enjoy the time that they're having there, that delight in their children. My friend Don Redmond just said about how every child should have somebody who delights in them. We can't assume that anybody delights in these children away from their doors. Even if they come in a fancy bow and a Jesus Loves Me t-shirt, that doesn't mean that they are getting that love at home. So we need to treat the time that we have with them as valuable, as this may be their only shot to feel what real, genuine love feels like, to have somebody delight in them, to have somebody meet their needs right when they need them, to have somebody let them learn that, that people exist when they can't be seen. Like, all of those things, those concepts are important for little guys. And if we assume that they're getting it home, we are missing a grand opportunity. Yeah,
that's a good reminder. How, if people are interested, how can they connect with you if they want to learn more, if they have any questions?
Probably the easiest way is to just, my website has links to everything. So amberlappin.com, there's 2 P's in Lappin. And if you are a Facebook person, my professional page on Facebook, I am very active there. So I answer questions in Facebook chat every single day, from, diaper, potty training to spiritual concepts to preschool tips, anything with early education, parenting, and also with children's ministry. So that's another great way to get a hold of me.
Cool. We'll link all that in the show notes as well so people can easily get to that. Thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast, for talking about this topic that I wanted you to come on and talk about, because it's not like a lot of people are talking about building faith in babies, even though, again, I think everybody listening is all for, like, nobody wants it to be childcare or just babysitting or whatever. But I don't know that everybody's thinking this either. So thanks for investing in this and taking the time and sharing with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me and for being willing to bring this out, because you're right. I think nobody's anti let's teach faith to babies, but I think not everybody's aware that you can. So thank you for putting a spotlight on that.
You bet. Thanks, Amber.
Thank you.
I actually read something this week, and this is weeks after Amber and I filmed that podcast, about how babies and like 1-year-olds, toddlers, that even before they're talking can understand language in some powerful ways, but they just, before they can talk, obviously don't have a way to say that back, or even when they can talk early on, can't communicate back what they're understanding. But through some different studies and things now, they're realizing that babies and toddlers are learning a lot more than we think from the words that we say. And so, kind of like Amber talked about in that interview, it's really important that we can build faith in babies. I think some of the action items I think about coming out of this podcast interview, one step would be to learn more about child development in that, in those years, in the early years, and using some of that information with your volunteers. That'd be the next step, is to pass that on, to train your volunteers with it. Get that in front of them. Maybe it's something from this interview, or you're going to connect with Amber and figure out how can you equip your team, your volunteers, to serve those age groups, infant, toddler, and maybe 2 years old, where a lot of times in churches, it really, in many ways, is mostly childcare. and you're going to bring something into it that's more than that. I think that'd be a great action step. Well, like I mentioned in the beginning, if you want to check out Trained Up, if you want to train your volunteers online, go to ministryboost.org/trained-up. And if you sign up, be sure to use the code BOOST10 to get 10% off of your subscription for life. Well, there you go. Another episode for you. I hope it was really helpful. I hope you can apply it to your church and to your ministry. And as always, I appreciate you listening and sharing, leaving ratings and reviews for the podcast, all that stuff. Just appreciate it. And I hope this has helped you lead your ministry better. Until next time, have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.